Hello everyone, it's Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards here, bringing you the first episode of my new series, Every Elden Ring Boss Ranked Best to Worst, with Sophie and Sin from Sinclair Law. This episode will be ranking the top 10 bosses. I've ranked each boss in the game by a set of 5 criteria that I feel give a good overall judgment on each boss. These are 1. Relative difficulty. How well the boss's difficulty fits their rough place within the player's progression. Bosses can get lower scores here for being both too easy and too hard. 2. Enjoyability. How fun the boss is to fight overall. 3. Flair. How visually interesting the boss's moves are. 4. Aesthetic. How visually interesting the boss itself and their arena are. 5. Uniqueness. How different the boss is from other bosses and enemies in the game. Note that this does not penalise bosses for being reused. In the case of a tie, the highest ranking of enjoyability will be used to determine the place. In case enjoyability is also tied, then I will simply choose which boss will be ranked higher. I will not be ranking every single iteration of reused bosses, although I will be ranking those bosses that are reused as part of a duo fight. In the case of bosses that are reused, I will only rank the version of the reused boss I prefer. I made this list based on a regular new game playthrough using a strength build with no spirit summons or regular summons allowed. To make sure I am judging each boss on level, I have used this map, which is linked in the description below, and have noted what level I beat each of the major bosses in the video. Finally, big thanks to Sophie and Sin for helping judge and discuss these bosses. Without further ado, let's start with number 10, Radigan Elden Beast. Radigan by himself is quite a good boss fight.
I think so, yeah.
I quite enjoy him.
Yeah.
It's just sort of a shame that he's smushed together with a worse fight, I think.
Significantly worse.
I would say it's worse.
I'd say it's significantly worse. I've
seen Elden Beast described as a giant glowing Magikarp, which I think is kind of apt, to be honest. A lot of it's just sort of flailing around, and it dives away from you. If you were a magic build, I can see it would be a lot easier, but certainly as a melee build, it's not.
It's not. No, I remember complaining about it and people suggesting that it's not that bad if you respec. And I think that's not really a very good answer. I can't think of another Souls game where the solution to anything is respec.
No.
I can think of some where it's use a slightly different weapon, but respec to a mage is not something I've really heard before.
Yeah, again, it's a shame because Radigan's only problem as a fight is the over-reliance on the AoE attacks.
Yes.
The just massive amounts. Because I think, as you mentioned before, Sophie, a lot of those fights in general towards the end of the game have that problem.
Yeah. I think, it reaches a point where they seem to have run out of, movesets to use. So they start recycling movesets, but giving them new moves that either take them into a place where you can't hit them, or they do a massive AoE, so the fight continues because you're either running away from it or running toward it. And to me, that just sort of got a little tiring by the end, because it's you're just sort of dragging this thing out by making me not hit it. And that to me is the biggest problem with Elden Beast, and I have looked at so many discussions, and it is not just me, that you spend so much of that fight just chasing it, and just running in a straight line towards something is not interesting.
Yeah, I think, Radigan, the look of both of them is really cool. Elden Beast is a visual spectacle.
Yeah.
And I do like the whole look with Radigan, with the grey and black body, and then the gold inside. That is really cool. But yeah, I think ultimately it's kind of as high as it is really because it looks really great and because Radigan as a fight by himself is actually pretty good. But it has that moment which happens a lot in Elden Ring towards the end with the boss fights where you're like, oh, thank God, I beat them. Wait, what? Then the second phase starts.
My only complaint about Radigan is that he's one of the first boss fights that introduces jumping as a mechanic, because you can jump out of his little smash thing, but because really none of the fights up until then have used jumping, firstly, it may not occur to you that you can do it. You might try to roll out of the way of something that you basically, unless you are very close to him, you can't roll out of. But also, it's not clear when you can jump, because I've clearly been off the ground and still had his little shockwave thing hit me.
Yeah, so I think, Radigan Elden Beast. Ultimately, they would have been way better as separate fights. I think I get the impression with a lot of the late game fights that they kind of just went, oh no, find a place for this. Let's stick it on the back of this fight. Yeah, so Fire Giant, again, he's also another one of those that's kind of up here mostly because he has a really good look and vibe. Massive giant. I mean, he truly is kind of colossal in a way that a lot of the fights sort of aren't. But yeah, he's only got 3 for difficulty and 3 for enjoyment because he's just not that enjoyable.
I think you sort of hit the nail on the head by describing him as colossal. Because the thing about the Souls-like combat engine is that there's really only one way to fight a giant. Because it's not Shadow of the Colossus. You cannot climb these things. They can't rely on you having ranged damage. So, ever since Demon Souls, the solution to every giant fight that's not based around Stormruler is you hit it in the ankle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, I feel like Fire Giant, there's a point where it's like, well, you hit it in the ankle, that's like not so much due to a surfeit of ideas, as like that's all that combat can really do because it doesn't count verticality. So there's nowhere else they can go with it. So the solution is that he makes the ground explode, so you have to keep running away from him. And then in the second phase, he rolls into a ball and somersaults away, so you have to chase him. And it's sort of like, it's not as bad as Elden Beast, but it's like, it's in the same ballpark of like, this fight is only taking as long as it is because you're not letting me fight it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the other problem for me is he has so many AoEs that are based around putting fire on the ground.
Yeah. And the thing about its AoE is like, it's not an explosion, it's little fire pillars like Bed of Chaos did. Again, a boss people don't like, so I have no idea why they did this again. The fact that it's the pillars, a lot of the time when I'm playing it, I'm just so sick of it, I'm like, I'm just gonna YOLO it. And I'm just gonna stand here and keep hitting it because there's a chance the pillars won't go under me. And I feel like that's maybe not a great approach, but it ends up happening.
Yeah, I think, again, like it's high up because it has a great look and a great feel to the fight. And I do think that's really, like, one thing that I wanted to get away from was just trying to rank the bosses based purely on either my own personal feelings or just on the mechanics.
Oh, absolutely.
Of the fight, because it's not really how people really engage.
Well,
with
that's
anyway.
that's the thing that's happened with Bloodborne. Like, we've talked about this before, but like, kind of in Bloodborne, the more interesting and out there a boss and the bigger impact it kind of has on the story and of your experience, the worse it is. Like, from a mechanical point of view. So you have, like, Moon Presence is not particularly interesting, Amygdala is not particularly interesting, like, but, like, from a fight point of view, but from an aesthetic point of view and the impact they have, they're, like, much more important than, like, Cleric Beast is. Yeah,
I mean, the last thing I was going to say about the Fire Giant is, it's interesting that I think... I vaguely remember in the Dark Souls 2 design works them mentioning how the original concept for Forest of Fallen Giants was that you would have a massive giant that would chuck pyromancy at you throughout the entire arena, at the entire level, and then the last giant would just be you fighting this thing, like at the top of Forest of Fallen Giants.
That sounds cool. I didn't know that.
And then in this game, it's like, oh, I guess they reused the concept of a massive fire giant, but just did it a bit differently. So coming in at number 8, we've got Morgots, the Omen King. The first fight we've talked about here that's on here because it's just a great fight. It's just a brilliant fight. I think I have it down as a 5 for difficulty. I've got it 4 for enjoyment. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but yeah, it's just a great fight. I like how he's big and beefy, but also agile. I also like how the damage is different depending on whether he hits you with his spectral blades or with his actual blade. And also, one thing I really like, it's one of the few fights in the game which you can fight him at both noon and night and has a very different feel.
Yeah.
Because if you fight him at noon, then when the curse comes out, like, it turns really foggy and grey and like dingy. But if you fight him at night, it has more of like a pathos to it because it's like night falls on the Erd tree.
And the pathos is important because I feel like Morgoth is kind of... I know he's not technically referred to as a demigod because he's an omen.
But he is.
Yeah, he is. He's one of the... really the only demigod, I think. I know, like, Redan has some, but, like, that there's a real sort of pathos behind what's going on. Because, like, Redan is obviously fallen, but his mind is completely gone at that point. Whereas Morgott knows what's happening. He reminds me a lot of Gwendolyn. He's the rejected one.
And he's the rejected one who nevertheless decides to, for whatever reason, to just kind of maintain the way they are.
Well, it's that, but it's he decides to maintain it in the face of absolutely hating everyone.
Yeah.
Because he opens with that scene where he's just telling all the demigods off. And he's just straight up to all these people are fucking just like, they're out for power, I don't really respect them, but it's up to me to make sure, like, the Erd Tree remains. And he is the one, in the end, that, like, Godfrey actually embraces. You were the true heir after all.
But yeah, as far as the fight goes, it's also nice that it builds on the Margit fight.
Yes.
Both, like, mechanically and visually. Like, he pulls out new spectral weapons that he hasn't pulled out before. He does new moves. And, of course, he has the big slam attack where he summons all these golden daggers and, like, shoves them into the ground. But yeah, I think it's the first fight that's here just because it's just a really good fight.
Yeah.
Really enjoyable and perfectly balanced for when you meet him in the game. I really noticed this, and we'll get to that when we get to Mog the Omen. But fighting Mog the Omen just before fighting Morgott, you could really tell which was balanced for that time,
absolutely.
and which was just like a later boss that had just been taken and like reduced the defense of.
Yeah, and also like that phase change where he talks about like the curse seeping out of him, like that also like that has a very emotive feel to it, because it's not like, oh, okay, phase 2, time to reveal my true power. It's like you actually, like, you wounded him, and he sounds wounded, and he sounds like he's been, he's lost his honor. He's embarrassed, and he's getting, like, it gets really personal.
Again, it's just a great, well-balanced mixture of like aesthetics and actual boss mechanics. It's also pretty great that you can get him to charge through his own throne, which is quite fun. Very sort of pathos there.
We're up to number 7 now, which is Praetor Reichhardt, Lord of Blasphemy.
I love this fight because it's silly.
Yeah.
It just is. It's a giant snake monster, but like a snake monster made in the most comical way possible.
Join myself and King as family. Together we will devour the very god.
There's so many enemies in Elden Ring that are like malformed sort of monstrosities. They're built for pathos like the Omens, or they're built to be horrifying like Godric, or those awful Royal Revenants, the horrible many-armed things. But then you just got Praetor Reichhardt, who just looks silly.
He's wonderful.
I love that. His face is the back of a serpent, and it's just... I think part of the reason why the fight is built the way it is with the gimmick is because... you're sort of meant to be able to fight him at anywhere between level 60 and level 100.
Yeah.
I mean, as a fight, obviously he's a gimmick boss. He can be quite tough the first time you play him because the snake does a lot of damage.
Well, I feel like the fact it's like... It's a gimmick boss, but it's tough, sort of, to me, makes it like, well, it's not really a gimmick boss then, because it's just a boss with a unique way of fighting it, which is that you have to use that spear. But like, as you were saying, he's quite damaging still. You have to hit him a lot. The obvious point of comparison is Yorm. But like, Yorm, if you get that Storm Ruler, Yorm is down in like 4 or 5 hits. Usually, probably won't even get to you. Like, you'll just kill him from the other side of the room. It feels like not interesting. Reichhardt, even though like you're using this weird laser thing to hurt him with, it's still like, it's challenging. Like, you have to learn his moveset, you have to figure out how to actually fight him. It's just that you're using a specific method of attack. I guess it's more like Stormruler in Demon Souls than anything else, but I think there's more going on than that. And they have to factor in, like, the lava and everything else that's going on, and, like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also the point that, and they do this with Hoaraloo in a much more obvious way, but, like, the second phase of the fight is set up to frighten you.
Yeah.
Like, when the sky goes red and all these spirits start coming in, you're thinking, oh my god, how do I fight? And if you just keep your cool...
Yeah.
And you work out what to do, and you run to one side or you dodge around, you'll be fine. But the fight is intentionally trying to spook you as the player.
Yeah.
And again, I quite like that because actually, in some ways, his second phase is easier than his first phase because he doesn't use the snake attacks nearly so often, and the sword attacks you can pretty much just roll them; they're fine. But yeah, the whole look of him is brilliant. The flair is brilliant. Again, I've given him 3 for difficulty. I think because ultimately. He's just not... Because he's kind of designed to be challenging at any point in the game, or at least it means that he's not that challenging at any single point.
Yeah.
Once you know what you're doing, and especially if you go to him later, you can tank a lot of his damage.
Yeah.
It's not that tough, but it is just a really fun, enjoyable fight, and he's just really unique. Again, I think the probably the best gimmick boss, or certainly the best boss that has a required way to fight them in the series.
Sin, do you have anything to say, Sin?
Yeah, great fight. Very challenging, very easy.
It's very challenging, very easy. It's the duality of Reichhardt.
But yeah, so that's Reichhardt, Lord of Snakes. Number 6 comes in as a Dragon Lord Placer-Dusax. Is that correct? Pronunciation?
It just sounds like an Asterix character.
It does actually. Placer-Dusax. I like this fight because it's like an older, more ponderous version of the other Ancient Dragon fights.
Yeah.
He's just he spends a lot of time sitting around, which means that although he has massively high defense, it doesn't really matter too much because you can just put a lot of damage on him pretty quickly. And like the first phase, it's cool because he does a lot of really flashy attacks. With the AoEs, but they're all really telegraphed, so it doesn't have the same problem with like Radigan or even with Hoaraloo, where you can just get caught by an AoE and it feels unfair. Whereas here, here it's like if you get caught by the AoEs, it mostly feels like your own fault for getting greedy. And he has the awesome magic nuke attack where he just destroys half the arena. Who doesn't love a fantasy nuke? And in phase 2, he goes absolutely nuts and just starts flying into you and teleporting everywhere. A really good marriage of a really fun, engaging fight, but also looking really, really cool and having a really cool kind of
also
aesthetic.
Almost justifies there being, like, I think over 20 identical dragon fights prior to this. Because you get very used to the idea that dragons behave in a certain way, so then when this absolutely massive thing shows up and acts like that, it really hammers home, like, yeah, this is actually meaningfully different.
I really like also how he looks damaged.
Yeah.
Like, he looks like he's already been... I'm assuming from when the comet hit for Missoula.
Yeah,
or maybe he got into a fight with Marika or something, but, he's already damaged. You're clearly not fighting him at full strength.
Yeah.
It has that Artorias feel, where it's like, you're not fighting this guy when he's actually at his full power. You probably couldn't beat him then.
No.
And same with Gwyn.
Yeah. Or Last Giant.
Or Last Giant.
Yeah, it's this sort of staggering broken thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also like how... Because the problem I have with the Lich Dragon fight particularly is that it spends a lot of time in the air. And so that can get really annoying. Whereas with him, when he's in the air... it's really obvious because he has the storm clouds coming towards you, so you can see where he's coming from. He even the teleporting isn't too much of an issue because if you lock onto him, then the camera just follows where it's teleporting to. And he only ever does the claw attack, which isn't that bad. But so that's the Dragon Lord, again, nice to have, as we kind of get into the top 5 or so, like, they start becoming a lot more balanced. They're just really great fights, because you kind of have to have a really good baseline in order to even get to the point where you're at 4 or above on all the different categories. Coming in at number 5, we have Godfrey, first Elden Lord, Hoaraloo. One of the few fights in the late game that has 2 phases which actually build on each other, rather than just being 2 random bosses smashed together. I like how it's a test of basic Souls stuff, timing, spacing, dodging, and I also like how the different phases have 2 different timings. So if you try and roll as you think you should, not based on how he actually is doing it, Hoaraloo will just destroy you, because he will pick you up and he will throw you around, and he barely gives you any time to heal.
I give him a 10 out of 10 because Red Sonja was one of my favorite movies growing up.
Oh, really? That's the one with that was Arnold Schwarzenegger's last film as Conan.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it was the Conan spin-off thing. I think Godfrey's interesting because the 2 sort of recurring things in the characters is fusing with something and having 2 identities.
Twinning, as you've mentioned, is a big thing.
And Godfrey does both because he's fused with Sarosh, but he also Godfrey is the nom de guerre of Hoaraloo.
Yep. And he even somebody else pointed this out to me. The way he talks in the first phase is different to how he talks in the second phase. It's like he's learned this very archaic Marika's way of speaking.
Be assured, the Elden Ring. Yeah,
resteth close at hand.
Resteth close at hand.
It reminds me of in the first Dark Souls, where it's maketh pilgrimage to the undead aside. It's so intentionally archaic, and then when he becomes Hoaraloo, he's just like, a crown is warranted with strength.
Now I fight as Hoaraloo. Warrior!
I like these games because they're inspired by various anime. Like this boss, for example, has a stand and is an absentee father, so clearly inspired by JoJo.
I mean, he looks like Joseph.
It reminds me of an inverse of Father from Bloodborne, the second boss, Gascoigne. It's like you think that Godfrey's going to turn into some kind of lion creature, but it's like, no, he just kills his lion.
Can I do a flex here? I have literally never lost this fight.
You've never lost? Now that is impressive.
I've never lost this fight. This is one of the few fights in Souls I've consistently every time first tried it, including when I started.
That is impressive, because it took me a long time to beat him.
I think because his attacks are mostly physical, so I was just holding my shield up when he was doing a lot of them. Okay, we are here. Sin has had to go because she has to go back home from where she was. And we're at number 4, which is Godric the Grafted.
Yes, so Godric, probably one of the best sort of first major boss fights in the series.
Absolutely.
I'd say. Really engaging, really fun. He is one of the best looking bosses in the game, I think. The grafted look. And I also just love how pathetic he is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That, I think, is the Martin influence, because they've never done that before, to my knowledge, in a Souls game before, where you have this really powerful demigod lord who isn't like a noble ruin of what he once was. He's just a pathetic, grasping, greedy old man.
There's a couple of characters like we talked about with Placidus Axe, where it's like they've sort of broken, but I don't think anything on the level of sort of just being pathetic.
And again, great job by the voice actor, really kind of selling that this kind of person, the way he is, in just a few lines. Like, that forefathers one will bear witness.
Yeah.
It's so pathetic.
Yeah.
It's so he just desperately wants the approval of the imagined God King of his ancestor.
Yeah, it's one of those lines that, like, if you maybe saw that out of context, you would just think this is embarrassing. Like, this whole game is stupid. Yeah. But the whole point is, like, no, Godric is embarrassing and stupid. Godric is a big, dramatic fool who wants everyone to notice him. That's not the tone of the game. That's the tone of Godric.
No.
Yeah. And, like, he's meant to, like, when he sticks a dragon on his arm, like, it's meant to look ridiculous and morbid. It's not supposed to look cool.
And the fight itself, I mean, aside from those kind of annoying mid-range attacks where he just throws wind at you, the hitboxes on that can be a bit wonky. But aside from that, I mean, the first phase of the fight is really engaging because he has a lot of moves, but also there's enough time for you, as long as you've got the timings down, to properly attack and roll away, punish. These like rolling attacks that he does are also really fun because they're really there's a lot of flair to them, and they also don't do too much damage, so you can get hit a couple of times and be okay. Like phase 2 for Godric is, I'd say like it can get a little tedious because a lot of the fire attacks are based around, again, like denying you entry towards him. Which can be kind of annoying, but you can use the arena. It's one of the first fights where the arena really matters because you can hide behind the big block where the dragon's on, and that will prevent the fire getting towards you.
And it gives you a lot of space. I was watching a friend fight Morg earlier, and like, I don't think Morg was designed to be fought in a rectangle like that. Like, it's very awkward.
Yeah, it's very awkward.
You talked about it getting tedious, and I think, like, a lot of the damage in HP is kind of all over the place, and I feel like maybe when you get to him, you tend to be underleveled if you're just playing the game through.
So that's Godric. Again, I think I've noticed, because I intentionally stayed away from other people's rankings, but in general, I think Godric is well seen as a good fight.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he is one of the best early fights there's ever been in a Souls game.
Yeah. And it's also a good mix of, like, physical and, like, fire attacks to sort of give you a nicely mixed up. And he's vulnerable to, like, most of the status effects you can have got by then. Like, you can bleed him pretty easily, you can poison him pretty easily. The arena's big enough that you can like, do it from a distance if you want. You have the space to do that. Yeah.
I actually, first time through, I got summoned by a naked archer who just used poison arrows. So I was their tank. And they were just firing from a distance, and it worked. It worked well. Coming in at number 3, we have the full-grown Falling Star Beast. I'm pretty sure this will be a bit of a controversial pick, but I just love it. I love how you can fight it on torrent well, because there's a number of bosses you can fight on torrent, but that don't really work particularly well on torrent.
Yeah.
I love the look of it. I love the fact that you're literally fighting in a meteor crater. I love its second phase attacks. It's a great mixture of like magic damage and physical damage, but also close combat. Because the regular Falling Star Beast is very close. It tries to get in close with you.
Yeah.
Whereas this one, it has beam attacks. It has all sorts of attacks.
Well, also, like, part of why it's feasible on torrent is that its AoE attacks are slow and they're small. And it's like, when it's attacking you from a distance, it's a beam. So the hitbox is quite small to avoid it. So it's feasible to fight the thing on torrent because you don't need iframes.
I sort of mentioned in my notes that like it's the closest thing we'll ever get to a playable St. George and the Dragon fight.
Yes, yeah. And it's got the this and Estelle, they have like the big blue glintstone things in their brains. Like Lusat's crown, yeah.
Nothing else in the game has that colour scheme. Like the bright blue and purple colour scheme. It's such a unique look. And it isn't overused. So whenever you see it, you think, this is Alien.
Yeah. Like, so one of the things I've talked about is, like, there's a whole lot of really interesting Alien stuff that is ultimately a footnote. But also, if they did... Like, this is the same thing with Bloodborne, where, like, if they overused that stuff, it would cease to have an impact. But the fact that there's only, like, a handful of actual, like, eldritch things really in it. And it makes you wait until kind of 2/3 of the way through the game to encounter them.
And yeah, I mean, it's in my opinion, it's the best field boss in the game by far.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing that keeps it off from a full ranking is just because although it's unique, and it has some, obviously it's not as unique because there is a different version of it. But aside from that, I love it. I think it's a brilliant fight, really well done. And again, it's one of those fights that you could completely miss, as I did first time through, if you're not looking for it. Because you think, oh god, this thing there, oh wait, I can get over there, quickly jump. But if you stay and fight it, you'll have a really, really good time. At least if you're doing it on torrent. I wouldn't recommend doing it off torrent, to be honest, because then it just becomes a worse version of the previous two fights.
Well, that was my problem, because at that point I was so used to getting off torrent if there was a boss that I didn't realize it was feasible, yeah. But I think they do a good job priming you to fight it on torrent by having the Spirit Spring be the only way to get there, so you will always enter that arena on torrent. Number 2 on our boss countdown is Renala, Queen of the Full Moon.
Yeah. She's here because basically she's the exact right fight for when you fight her. The only slight issue with her is the first phase is too easy. But aside from that, if you fight her on level, like if you go to Rare Lucaria fairly early on, once you've got to Liurnia of the Lakes, she'll be directly on level for you.
Yeah, I was level 35, I think, when I fought her.
I think I was level 35.
She's scaled to basically right after Godric.
The atmosphere for that fight is incredible, both phases. The whole thing with the sweetings in the first phase is interesting. Again, it's not tough, but I do like the atmosphere. It's like, I know a lot of people have compared Rare Lucaria in general to Hogwarts because it's the obvious comparison. But I'd say like that's the only part of it that really feels like Hogwarts, with like the books everywhere and the school gowns and the what do you call them? The graduate caps, all of the scholar caps, yeah. And like it's not hard, but it's also fairly unique. And the idea of like the ever rebirthing sweetings is a cool and like creepy, but not like, it's not creepy like Godric, where it's like this horrible monstrosity. It's creepy in a much more existential kind of way.
I feel like if she were harder, she would be worse.
Yeah.
Because that first phase, like, a lot of the multi-phase fights in the Souls games, like, people will call the first phase basically the healing tax. Like, it doesn't feel like it's the real fight, it feels like it's just there to hurt you. And the first phase of Renala would feel like that. If it were any tougher than it is, but it's over in like 30 seconds.
Basing a boss fight partially around summoning, like there's a few bosses that try that in Elden Ring, but Renala's the only one that really gets it right, because you're not meant to fight the summons, you're meant to go around them, because they only stay for 5-10 seconds.
It's similar to Elana. Yeah, except Elana's summons felt like a lottery. This one feels like she just has a varied moveset that happens to be summons.
Yeah, and I also, when she summons the giant and the dragon, has some real flair to it, has some really kind of like engaging look to the whole thing. I saw a YouTube comment that was like, they finally got like a magic boss right. Like you finally fight somebody who feels like a true, like a top tier wizard. And that's really true, because the other obvious comparison is Gideon Ofnir, which doesn't quite work because you just run up to him and just dodge his attacks and bonk him on the head over and over again. But no, great fight. Again, whatever's going on with Rani, who knows? But the actual fight itself, brilliant. And yeah, enough like ranged magic attacks to counterbalance by the summons that tend to do more like physical damage up close.
Well, I feel like, just in general, magic in Elden Ring, it feels a lot more immediate, and it feels a lot more dynamic, because it tends to it acts like a laser, like it acts like a ranged gun. It tends to take the form of like lots and lots of like very fast shots, as opposed to, if you think about fighting Gwendolyn or something, where it's like sort of very slow things that are easy to dodge. Whereas Renala's like, it's a mixture of like slow things that are easy to dodge, but also she's like, she can home in on you, she can do little like sort of like little shots at you, stuff like that. It feels more like a
Yeah.
I was about to say feels like a fight with an armored core mech, but then the next one coming up is so.
But so that's Renala, Queen of the Full Moon. The best magic-based fight they've ever done, and definitely a great model for how to do a wizard in an action RPG and have the fight be meaningful. Coming in at number 1, the best boss in the entire game is Scourge Redan, or General Redan, whatever you want to call him, Chadan, the Beast of the Stars. Just an absolutely amazing fight. Really cannot say much else to that. He's the only boss that I've given more than 25 for, because that flare just... the first time he did that, when he goes off into the sky and comes down as a meteor and just smashes back into the earth, it's something else.
Absolutely.
It absolutely knocks your socks off. Just a brilliant... And I have a real pet peeve with fights in the Souls games that have 2 phases, but those phases don't really build on one another. And Redan has almost 3 phases, where like he after he comes back down, he gains the energy attacks, but then he gains even more of those when you get him down to like 20% health. He does those like jumping attacks where he flips around in the air and slams into you, or he like shoots those big rocks at you from a distance. And I also like the fact that even though he's not leveled that high, the summons work because they don't take away from the fight, and they make him feel like you're fighting like a really powerful demigod, even though really like he's not that hard in comparison, at least post-patch, in comparison to say Melania or Mog or even Godfrey. Like he's not that tough.
Yeah. It's another fight that, like, it works well on Torrent. It's, like, one of about 3 that do. Because, that first phase where he's firing the bolts at you, like, the bolts have a very small point of impact.
Yeah.
So you can go around them. I guess the other thing I like about Redan is, like, I've talked about this with Demon Souls, but, like, the Archdemon fights in Demon Souls, they're all, in a sense, some sort of gimmick.
Yeah.
And they're the gimmicks that, like, you would expect from the Armored Core games that From had done before. Which, interestingly, like, Miyazaki had worked on prior to this. And when you think of them that way, it becomes very, I kind of get it now. So, like Phalanx is a central unit protected by all these drones. And, like, Storm King is an aircraft carrier. But they just have this sort of fantasy skin applied to them. And Redan, like, as soon as it happened, I knew exactly where it was from. This is one of the boss fights from Armored Core for Answer called Mother Will, which is an enormous walking tank that you fight in a desert. And, the way that the fight begins is you have a huge jetpack attached to you, and you have to shoot toward it as it's firing these energy blasts at you from this huge cannon on its back. And it's exactly the same setup as you approaching Redan. And it's like, it works really well.
I also like the fact that if you go back to Redan late game, like level 80 to 100 or so, you can just do him solo. You know, like it's not impossible. I mean, he's not designed to be fought that way, and I do think like you miss out on a lot of the fun of the fight if you do that. But it's an option. Yeah. You can also decide again, like, do I want to use all the summons or only a couple of summons? You can sort of make your own difficulty for the fight in a way, which again, I like how experimental a lot of the fights in Elden Ring are, and usually that works. Sometimes it doesn't, but most of them it works, and Redan is just the best example of that.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I also like how, and a lot of people have pointed this out, right? Like when you see those pictures of like him and Melania in the intro, you think, like the kind of barbarian, frenzied warlord against the kind of like honourable swordstress. And then you realise it's kind of the opposite, where actually like Redan is the honourable one. He's the one who fights her, and she's actually the one who kind of basically has to completely lose her own. Millicent says that she loses her restraint in order to try and fail to defeat him, but sort of stalemate him. And also, of course, the horse is just, again, it's that little bit of humour. It's silly, but it's just the right amount of silly that it feels like you're playing a high fantasy game that isn't taking itself as seriously as say Dark Souls did, which works.
No. So it's also the thing we talked about with Godric, where it's like this character is ridiculous because they've become a parody of themselves.
Yeah.
It's not like this happens a lot when like Sin and I talk about stuff in the games being silly. People think it's a criticism.
No, it's not.
And it's like, no, it's because it's like they're not sitting around thinking to themselves, oh yes, an enormous man with no legs on a tiny horse is like an imposing sort of it's a parody. It's ridiculous.
Yes, but yeah, no, Star Scourge Redan, just a brilliant fight. Maybe not my favourite fight in the entire series, just because there are certain like preferences that I have for certain kinds of fights. But I'd say, like, in terms of a demigod fight, a shard bearer fight, a great one fight, it is the best. It is the first time in like an action RPG, non-turn-based, that I've really felt in a video game that I was fighting a god, like an actual god.
Yeah. That's why the gimmicks work, because it's like, well, if you were fighting a demigod, it wouldn't just be a duel. Like, they would be something that was so removed from that.
Yeah, and again, the way that the attacks layer on top of each other for the phases, the way that the second phase starts with the meteor incoming, it's just perfect. I almost can't fault it, really, for what it's trying to do. It's just brilliant. So yeah, that's Star Scourge Redan. Well, that was the first 10 bosses of every Elden Ring boss ranked best to worst with Sophie and Sin. Please check out their channel below. They do great Elden Ring, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 2 content. I actually recorded a podcast with them about the philosophy of Dark Souls 2, which you can see linked down below. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye!